When we first messaged each other on Twitter, you reached out to me through a mutual friend that we have, Owen and Carlene Macmillan. They were on my show. I built a nice friendship with them. And you reached out. Owen told me I had to talk to you. And upon doing some of my research, which I was telling you before we started recording, I'm not really a big research guy when it comes to some of these conversations, but you are a fascinating individual. And I think, Daniel, it's a perfect time to bring you on the show, dude.
I think it's a pleasure to meet you. Number one, yeah, we've been trying to sort of arrange this for a couple of months. Owen told me about you as well, and I listened into the show you guys did together, and it was quite a fascinating, interesting piece. Um, so yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about me and sort of where I've come from with all of this and why sports betting and problem gambling are my intersection that I work on every day with Kindbridge. Um, but I'm actually interested in what did you dig up on me, because that's always an interesting find. So tell me, what did you find?
So you're the founder and CEO of Kindbridge, which I'm sure you're well aware of. It's the world's first teletherapy company that focuses on the successful treatment of gambling and gambling addictions. You went to MIT.
Yeah, I did. I did for a little while. I've got quite a interesting academic background. Uh, this is true. I started off in Southwest Missouri. When I was there, it was Southwest Missouri State, and then shortly after, to Missouri State University, and then bounced around on the West Coast for a little while. Did a little bit of time at Stanford, did a little bit of time at George Mason University over in Virginia. And then later on in my career, I needed to go back and get some further education on leadership. And so I did a little bit of time at MIT. So um, I do have a tendency to continue to go back into academia every couple of years just to keep myself fresh and up on top of the topics that I'm interested in. So yeah, that is true. That is true. Um, yeah, so I'll dig into that a little bit. So born and bred in St. Louis, Missouri, spent 18 years there and then moved south. After completing my first portion of my education down there, I moved out to the West Coast, started working with a management consulting group, which got me really interested in healthcare. And so I started doing a lot of healthcare projects in some of the larger institutions across the country. Worked at Stanford for a little while on their hospital system, worked with Cleveland Clinic for a little while, a variety of other smaller health systems across the country, all sort of leading me into the passion of really wanting to do better by people who need access to healthcare. Um, and then in 2008, I moved overseas. I spent some time in Malaysia and some time in the Philippines and some time in Hong Kong. Um, Met my wife while I was actually in the Philippines. She's British. We were working on a project together and continued to tour the world for quite a while, lived in Australia for a bit. We were due to settle down in San Francisco, and then we had a family tragedy that struck, which took us to England. And so now we reside in sunny Southampton, which is about an hour and 15 minutes south of London. And we split time between the UK and the US. So when I do go back to the US, I typically either go to St. Louis or Nashville. My brother is in Nashville. So that tends to be my stomping ground when I spend extended amounts of time there. As of late with Kindbridge, I've been going to Washington, D.C. a lot, and I've been going to New York a lot. There's just a lot of partners that are coming out of those areas. There's a lot of political issues that are being dealt with on the sports betting space and the treatment for problem gambler space that are coming out of Washington. A lot of sports leagues and teams and stuff coming out of New York. So it's been an interesting trip. Definitely touched down in quite a few countries, helped with a lot of different population health strategies for different countries and different health systems that are trying to solve big problems. So yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell where I come from and what I've done. Right around the beginning of 2020 when COVID hit, I started paying really close attention to what was happening with VC money and what was happening with telehealth law. And it became really obvious really quick that tele in the US was finally going to hit a tipping point where there was no turning back. Some of the things that I'd noticed previously when I was working in the US was that there was plenty of telehealth projects that were being built, but there weren't a lot of buyers. So we would build these absolutely fantastic platforms that helped with access, but we kept running into roadblocks with insurance companies, and we'd run into roadblocks with physicians who just didn't want tele as part of the solution. Well, COVID changed all that. And so the telehealth laws came down, the access laws started to shift, and the money that was being poured into tele just said, you know what, now is the absolute best time to start putting together a national safety net using tele, leveraging what we can do with a centralized treatment body across the entire country, house it underneath one company, and really just drive quality for individuals who need access to either coaching, psychoeducation, skills building exercises, group therapy, therapy for the individual, sort of all of those things to really start to build a virtual center of excellence where anyone with a gambling problem can present and get everything that they need under one roof. So we've been going at that since about August of 2020. We're about a year and a half in. It's been an interesting year and a half, made some really good relationships, helped a lot of people. And it continues to blossom and people continue to find us. So that's the eclipsed version of everything that has happened. Do you have any questions?
Oh, I got a bunch, and I was taking notes. And you did warn me, for the listeners too, that this opening intro of running down everything was going to be very lengthy. But I did take in a lot. It makes sense now why when I gave you my address to the studio, you were like, yeah, buddy, that's not going to work out because I'm not in New York. So that all makes sense now that you're living overseas. So the MIT thing, were you at MIT when the whole blackjack thing was going down? Because that's one of my favorite movies and stories of all time. The movie 21. Yeah, man.
No, I was not at that time. I was at MIT was 2016, right? So well after all of that had gone down, right? So yeah, like I said, like my relationship with academia goes in spurts, right? So I tend to find myself out of academia for a while and then dig back in for skills building purposes, basically. But yeah, 2016 was MIT. So no, unfortunately, I was not there for that. Although, you know, I would say that has definitely left a nice little. It's something to talk about, you know, all the time, really, around those circles.
It's funny how MIT is one of the most prestigious schools in the country, and me, when I hear MIT, immediately think of the blackjack story. So that just goes to show you the kind of individual that I am, Daniel. I'm fascinated how you got into the gambling space because, correct me if I'm wrong, from what I'm catching, this wasn't something that you kind of grew up around or with.
No, I would say very much the opposite. I mean, St. Louis, I don't know exactly when there was always riverboats, right? There was a couple of riverboats, and then later, I must have been probably 15 or 16, a major casino went up, but it was still, 35, 40 minutes away from where I grew up. Wasn't really a big attraction. I couldn't get into it basically, right? So there was no real attraction when I was living in St. Louis to go gamble or to partake in any of that. I would say like my gambling days came when I was at university, because where I was situated in southern Missouri was about a 2-hour drive from Miami, Oklahoma. So literally right across the border from Missouri to Oklahoma, you've got a handful of tribes that have a handful of casinos right there on the border. And that would be one of the things that we would do on the weekends would be, pile 6-7 deep in a car at the time. And then drive down 2 hours and play $2 blackjack for a couple of hours and hang out, and then work our way back at 4:00 in the morning. Typical university age style play. I don't know how old you are. I'm 38, so I've been out of university now for quite a while. But when I was in university, you had to go to Vegas if you wanted to do any kind of sports betting legally. And there just wasn't, it was all far enough away from me that I never really had the desire to get in the car and drive that far. But when I turned 21, I did quite enjoy hitting up the casinos up in St. Louis when I would go home. Matter of fact, my brother's after party and also my after party at my wedding that we did in the US was at the casino. So
now we're talking.
Yeah, what do you know? I didn't grow up, like, we didn't bet on sports or anything like that in the family. Gambling wasn't something that my parents did. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure my parents have only ever been in a casino for my wedding and my brother's wedding. So it's just not one of those things that was ever really a dominant player in my life. I got interested in it because I didn't actually know at the time that it could become problematic. It never really occurred to me. It was just not something that I thought about, right? Like all of my experience in healthcare was around physical, right? It was all looking at, as ortho, right? Like looking at knees and hips and things like that. All around like more advanced cancer treatments and things like that, right? So like addiction and psychiatry and psychology and mental health wasn't something that was ever really on my radar until I got introduced to the gambling world. And I got introduced to the gambling world in such a weird way, right? I literally got off of a plane from Aberdeen, having wrapped up what I was doing up north, and got met by this guy that I was now working with this RegTech company at the airport, who picked me up and took me to ICE. And I don't know if you know what ICE is, but ICE is like the largest casino conference on the planet. And it's run out of London. And so like once a year, the industry gets together, showcases all of their products, showcases everything that they've got that they're bringing into the market. And a ton of vendors just show up, and a ton of buyers just show up. And it's just like this amazing display of everything that's coming down the pike for the industry. And then there was this teeny tiny little section that was kind of cordoned off all the way in the very back of a giant convention center that was dedicated to responsible gambling. And I remember it was like, at the time I'm like monitoring my step count, right? Like that's like a thing, right? Like monitor your step count. And I just remember I spent, 4 hours at ICE, and I clocked something stupid like 17,000 steps in 4 hours. It was just insane. It was that big. And the responsible gambling section got very, very, very little love. And so it was immediately kind of like, oh, this is interesting. Obviously, this is a subject that's not on everybody's, plate of interest. And then we wrapped that up, and then we hopped in the car and we drove 3 hours to Birmingham. And Birmingham is where the UK Gambling Commission is located. And we walked into the Gambling Commission and had a chat with them about how to provide wider protections across the country. And I thought to myself, well, now we're talking. Like, this could seriously be something that was really interesting. And so, I spent about 2 years doing that, and I got exposed to a lot of things that made me think a lot about what individuals that suffer from a gambling addiction need in order to be successful in recovery. And then also a lot about how to reach them. How do you present when you have a mental health problem, or when you have an addiction like alcohol or pills or something like that, right? But really, you factor in the additional stigma that comes with the fact that you've basically lost the house, you've lost the car, you've lost the wife, you've lost the kids, you've just lost everything. Your 401k's gone. Anything that you had, packed away in savings for a rainy day is history. And you just have no idea how to dig yourself out of the hole and get yourself back to square. Thinking a lot about, what does that person need at that moment in time? What will actually make them reach out for help? And then how do you get them the kind of help that they need to be successful? So I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and there's a lot of lessons learned because I get exposed to both sides. The UK has got, what is considered to be sort of the gold standard across the globe in terms of gambling regulation and in terms of consumer protections for the individual, and then access points for individuals who need care. But there's a lot of, I'm going to get shot for this later, but there's a lot of failings on that part. There's a lot of shortcomings in that system. And there's a lot of things that can be done better. So that's ultimately what I'm focusing on is trying to do better by the person who needs access to care, and sort of meet them where they are and bring them the tools that they need to be successful. So that encompasses quite a lot. That encompasses everything from care access to dealing with insurance companies to make sure that insurance companies are on board with gambling addiction being a reimbursable disease. It is registered in the DSM as an addiction, but that doesn't mean every insurance company is interested in helping a person who's got this particular addiction. So lobbying and working with insurance groups to make sure that access is first and foremost for individual available. That's part of it. Keeping up with what's going on with regulation from state to state, and doing what we can to provide evidence, or at least just have a conversation with legislatures around what kind of protections need to be made available through the bills. What other types of signposting needs to be in position for an individual to present other than just a hotline. So it's a lot of advocacy, and it's a lot of trying to bring healthcare into a space that hasn't really had the handshake with healthcare from 2022, so to speak. I'm going to shut up for a minute because I do have a tendency to just go on and on and on and on.
It's cool, man. It's part of how your brand is, and I like the storytelling. And I am getting a lot from this from listening. But to backtrack a little bit, you asked my age. I'm 30. I'll be 31 probably around the time that I'm posting this episode. I'm 30 now. Little background in myself. I'm someone who I kind of grew up around betting and gambling, the whole nine. And I do think that there's a difference between the two, which is a question I want to ask you, because it's something that I've been preaching for years. And since this is your expertise, I would love to, sort of either be validated or put in my place, depending on what my stance is. But I grew up around it. So my family's Greek, and I'll never forget how I got into betting. I'm 7 years old, and my one of my uncles gives me a parlay card. He's like, "Hey, buddy, pick 4 games, 4 teams to win." I don't know any football at the time. I was a soccer guy growing up. I really didn't dive into football until I was about 14, 15 years old. I started playing it more in high school, and then I fell in love with it. But I give him a parlay card. I give the parlay card back. I picked 4 winners. Next week, he comes over, gives me $20. 7 years old. I'm like, oh, this is easy. Pick a couple games, right? What an introduction. This is a layup. Spoiler, everybody. Not so easy, that's for sure. But then I always became fascinated, Daniel, by the numbers, right? Like I feel like everyone has their own thing that they kind of like are obsessed with or nerd out about, right? Like it might be comic books, it might be the stock market, it might be whatever it might be. But for me, it was always sports betting. And I was fascinated by how often the number lands on 49 when the over under is 50, right? Like how close it gets, things like that. And it was a way that always separated me from my group of friends and just in general. And the way I built my brand is, sports betting, those conversations can make you a smarter actual sports fan. Because the one thing that I feel like sports books do is there's no bias. They want to make money. So that's a nice way of you understanding, oh, I think this team per the Vegas sports books, or now, I mean, it's sports books all over the place, right? Since it's legal in many places. But this sports book thinks that Manchester United is going to finish fifth in the Premier League, or the Giants, as a Giants fan in New York, they have no chance to surpass 5 wins. It kind of brings you back down to earth as a sports fan. So that's always been an obsession with me with sports betting, how it's made me a sharper sports fan. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, 100%. Yeah, it's not uncommon at all. Like I mean, I can argue it's not even an argument, right? It's more of a statement of fact that I think my career has all been around looking at and analyzing numbers to make smarter decisions, right? Like if you can get data that helps you become an informed individual, be that a consumer or be that a person who's in charge of running a business, it's going to help guide you in any way, shape, or form to a decision that makes sense, right? It might not always be the right decision, right? And I think that that's the same in life, right? Like you can have as much data in front of you as possible, but you could be missing something. There's a variable that, like even if you've run the model 1,000 times, maybe on 1,001, it gives you the outcome that you never saw, but that's the outcome that happens, right? Yeah, no, so I mean, it makes perfect sense to me all the way through.
Yeah,
so would you consider yourself, are you a sharp then? Would you consider yourself a sharp?
That's a lot of pressure and a label that I would have to throw on myself. But I will say this, it's impossible to always be right, right? Like we try to be perfect in an imperfect genre in the world when it comes to sports betting. Professional sports bettors strive for about 55%. If I showed up back in high school with a 55 on my math test, my mom would, slap the shit out of me basically, right? But in sports betting, if I could tell people, hey, I pick 55% every single year, there's ways that you could maybe get a loan or do something crazy like that and ask people for money to invest it. But the thing about sports betting, and to answer your question, I think sometimes the best decision I make is the one that I don't put. So like I like to inform people. I like giving people information, how I see things going, where money is coming in on, tickets coming in on, trends, right? And yeah, there are exceptions to every rule when you're looking at it from a game to game prospect. But I think that from an understanding and what things mean, I hold myself to a very high standard, Daniel. So yeah, I guess I would answer that yes when it comes to your initial question.
Fair enough, man. That's good. Like that's, it's, I've met a lot of people in the industry. Some are what they would consider sharps, right? Some of them have got their methods, they've got their ways, they've got their recipe, they've got their formulas, they've got their superstitions in some cases. Um, and then I've been on the other side of the coin where I've met the folks that are just in tatters over a bunch of poor decisions that all accumulated in a very short period of time, or there were a bunch of poor decisions that were accumulating in clusters. And then they accumulated into large failings, large losses over a long period of time. Right. So, I mean, I've met tons of interesting folks, right? So I'm not going to get into disclosing names or anything, right? But, I came across a guy who was on the World Series of Poker Tour for a really long time. And he came to me and he said, what really started to show the deterioration quickly was when these young kids started coming in with a little bit different way of thinking, a little bit different way of playing, right? And I was getting creamed. And I started thinking to myself, maybe it's time. Like maybe it's time. Maybe I've lost my edge, right? Maybe it's time to just step out. And then he thought, fuck it. No, I'm doubling down. Forget it, right? And he went in and he was trying like hell to compete with these young guys. Just all kinds of statistics at their fingertips, different types of technology using to, train them and kind of keep them sharp. Whereas he's this guy who's crossed the threshold of 55, doesn't engage much with technology, reads a book here and there, just doesn't stay on top of it with sort of skills development, and then ends up just creamed, loses everything, his entire career earnings just gone, history, right? And he's homeless underneath an overpass for a while he's trying to sort it out and figure out what's going on. And he keeps trying to claw his way back into it because it's the only thing that he knows and it's the only thing that he's ever done. Right. So you come across stories like this, and they're not all as grandiose as guys who have sat at the final table type thing, right? And you get a lot of stories of just regular folks who would dip away and go play the slot machines for a while, or they'd go spin the roulette wheel, or they'd sit down and play blackjack, and they'd do it to cope with the loss of something, or do it to just sort of escape whatever it was that was going on in life. And then all of a sudden it just became a habit and just became routine. They just kept finding themselves going over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And they weren't people who were educating themselves on what the odds were of the game, right? They weren't people who were paying close attention to the numbers. I would say, a fair amount of them were educated enough because they played enough that they'd got kind of a feel for it. And they could kind of tell you some basics when it came to numbers, but none of them were ever, not a lot of them that I've come across have ever been like really into it, like the 21 style, right? And, then they start stealing from their wife. They start stealing out of the retirement fund. They start stealing from their company. And they're just trying to get the money back that they lost to replace the funds from whichever account they managed to borrow out of to be able to sit down at the table. And it always ends in disaster when that recipe really starts to come right. So it's both, man. You gotta, it's like everything. You got good and you got bad. You got both sides. And a lot of it does come down to decisions. A lot of it comes down to the way that the brain works. A lot of it comes down to the way that you get kind of hooked into patterns. A lot of it comes down to what's going on up there, what's firing to, sort of get you humming. So much of it stems from what's going on throughout your life, and even all the way back to some childhood trauma in a lot of cases. And with gambling, when it comes to addiction, it's not always just about having made the wrong decision, if that makes sense, right? If you're well and truly hooked into something and you're not making the right decisions anyway, what's driving it, right? And most of the time it's that compulsive behavior, it's that addiction. That's what's really starting to hijack and take over your brain, and overriding any of the sensibilities that you have, right? So yeah, it's an interesting subject, and like go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanna jump in there because I like talking from experience because I've been on that end. I've been in scenarios where when I go to a casino, and I go to Vegas often. I'll actually probably be in Vegas around the time that this episode releases. When I go to casinos, Daniel, I don't indulge in slots. I don't indulge in the standing roulette table. I have a very strict hit and go, hit and run roulette right before my friends and I go out to a club or to a pool party. Let's throw like $50 on red. Or if we want to get really crazy, let's throw it on a number and then I'm out. I do not stay at those kind of games for too long. Craps, I like going with my buddies. We have a little tradition. Every time we go to a casino, when we go on a trip that has a casino, we reserve a craps table for about an hour. We let them know that there's about 12, 15 of us. We want it just to be us. We have some fun, nothing too crazy. No one gets too wild. Then we go out to dinner. That's always like a staple on a vacation. But those games, I don't like those games. I'm a big Texas Hold'em guy. When I go to casinos, I like playing poker. And I haven't lost when I go play. I know it might sound crazy, but it's a game that I control a lot of the outcome. Yeah, have I lost like 50 to $100? Yeah, but I don't blow my entire bankroll on it. And I come out pretty positive in a lot of those scenarios. One is because I know the game really well. You were talking about the guy on the World Series of Poker. I was one of those poker kids about a decade ago. I have a Poker Stars shirt, a full tilt shirt. I was in the trenches. I got a gift card for Christmas one year, and it was for about $200 because, what are you going to get someone that's 20, 21 years old? You're not going to get them a shirt. You're not going to get it. You might not like it, right? So I get a gift card. What do I do? Being the degenerate that I was, where that was around the time when I was really into gambling, like bad. And I put it on Poker Stars, and I turned that $200 into $11,000 doing sit and goes. I show my father. My father's blown away. He's angry at me, but he's impressed also because he knew I like poker. In my head, I'm sitting in class now. I'm at CW Post, a private school, and all I'm thinking in my head are hands being played. Like that's all I can think about. I'm like, I turned $200 into $11K. I'm the fucking man. That's what I'm thinking, right? Couple months later goes by. Go by. FBI, the federal agency, comes in, shuts down the Black Monday or Black Friday. I think it was Black Friday. Lost $11,000. Lost it. Gone. Never got it back. Whatever money you had in there, gone. So I've been that person that was super hooked into gambling. I've sold an Xbox to pay my bookie. I'm not proud of it, but it's what had happened that brought me to this point here now too. I've asked people for money and came up with egregious lies as to why I needed the money in order to take care of this gambling debt. It's a lot easier for me to say now because I've built this show out. I'm working with a sports book now. I talk about betting now. And a lot of people always ask me now, with it being so popular and legalized and everyone's sending screenshots of bets that they hit or bets that they like, I don't bet every day. So it's become something that through the years, through the bad experiences, through the years of making $1,000 a week working and delivering pizzas and waking up in the morning to go with my dad and then gambling 1,200 of it and always chasing, I learned that, all right, man, this is out of control. Starting the podcast 6 years ago really helped me out because it allowed me to talk about it, and I was able to fulfill my vices through talking about it in a very weird way. So when it comes to gambling addiction, that's something I definitely want to dive into now. That's a little bit of my story of how I was able to get rid of it. I love gambling now. I love betting though, right? Like I love betting. I don't like gambling. And I think and tell me how you feel about this. Is there a difference between the two? It's something I'm very passionate about because I believe there is a difference.
Tell me why you think there's a difference between the two.
Okay, so I think gambling, when I think of gambling, I think of something that you don't have much control over. A roulette wheel, a what's another slot machines, right? I no matter how much research I put into it, when it comes to gambling, I think that there's an element of no control that you have over the outcomes. Where in betting, poker, if I have 2-7, I'm gonna fold it. If I have ace king and I'm on the button, I'm in a strong position here. If I have pocket eights, I'm in a strong position there. So I'm betting there. Sports betting too. I feel like there's a way that you can get an edge on certain things. If you know the sport, if you know the trends, if you know some of the background going into it. So I think there's a huge difference between betting and gambling. And in gambling, a lot of times you're kind of drawing dead also, to use that poker analogy.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's the way I look at it is products, right? Like casino has got so many different products that drive somebody in. It's all under the band of entertainment, right? But even now it's like now they're introducing betting on esports and things like this, right? So, you can go away and do your homework on, whichever esports team it is that you're a big fan of and want to support. You can do the same kind of homework you can on sports, right? It's a different kind of education process. Like when it comes to spinning a wheel or when it comes to rolling the dice, you just got to know the odds, and you just got to know that product is a different product to play versus the others. So I don't know that I would agree that they're different. I just see them underneath the same sort of umbrella as it's a product that is there for entertainment. And with all of them, you can really educate yourself on what your odds are, and you just got to calculate your risk and understand what it is that you want to do. Right. And I think that's sort of how I choose to look at it. Right. Like sports betting is always, for me personally, right, like sports betting is the one thing that, like, yeah, I wouldn't, I like for the horses, right? Like for Churchill Downs, right? Or,
the Derby,
for Madness, right? Yeah. Or the Super Bowl, stuff like that, like that kind of stuff. I find digging around, doing some research and placing a bet, right? Like it doesn't bother me at all. But I've never been a poker player, so I'm not really going to take that risk. My brother was a poker player and he'd kick my ass every time we would sit around and play. And he was one of those guys that would be like, oh, I know you got, I know you have this. I know you have 8-10, like he's a talker at the table. He's like, just based off of the way you're reacting to the cards that fell, you have an 8-10 type thing. And I'd just be like, God, what are you, a clairvoyant? Like, this is just bizarre. So it was never something that I really took to. It just wasn't. And then just, knowing what the house odds are on things, it's a choice on what you want to play, right? And what you want to do and what your palatable level of risk is. And I think that that's just sort of across the board with all gambling products, right? So I'd say that's my take on it. It's not like a direct answer. It's kind of veiled in a couple of different examples, but I don't particularly see it as different. I see it as different understanding how to play a game, right, and how they're played. But I still see the risk on the other end, because even if you don't know what the odds are on the wheel when you spin it, right, how do you know what the odds are on the free safety going out in the middle of the game, which completely changes the way the coverage is done and your whole thing's blown, right? So there's unpredictable factors in sports betting, which, right, which comes down to like an interesting piece. And, it's a topic that, maybe you find it of interest, maybe not. I don't know. I haven't had a ton of conversations around it, but it did come up when the Miami Dolphins coach, Brian what's
Flores.
What's his name? Flores. Yeah. When he came out and said that the coach was offering him $100,000 to basically not show up for games, right? Like how much of that might be going on? Is that going on? Right. Like what kind of influencing factors are going on there that, match fixing is a very, very big business. And there's integrity associations that are dedicated to scouring data to look for anomalies that give you an indicator on whether or not there was some foul play going on in the game. And it's a big business. There are companies that literally rake in money hand over fist, literally just to analyze every single play and look for anomalies that is inconsistent with previous play, highlight it, flag it, and then investigate it and send it over to the league for investigation. And it's a situation, esports in particular, only because I've just recently had the conversation around it. I mean, esports match fixing is just off the charts, right? Like it's just off the charts. Way more so compared to some of the more traditional sports. And esports is just sort of at the very beginning in its infancy. A little bit of regulation moving into the space, but way more opportunity to fix than there is on the grand scale of things with some of the leagues. But I mean, I put it to you, what do you think in scenarios where coaches are accused of, or not coaches are accusing owners of paying them to throw the game? What do you feel about that?
Well, that's why it becomes such a big issue, because the one reason why everybody was so hesitant about sports betting being legalized, they always would bring up the same phrase, the integrity of the game.
Right. And
I always
felt
felt like Daniel,
the way that
the integrity of the game could be jeopardized would be at the collegiate level.
Not so much at the professional level. My friends and I that we've had on the show,
we always bring up the same players. So to my audience, it's probably a little repetitive.
If you were to go up to Chris Paul, who makes $40 million a year,
and say, "Hey man, I need you to miss a couple free throws. Here's $50,000.
I make that on 9 dribbles.
I make that on 9 dribbles.
Now,
get out of here.
At the professional level, I think it's harder for the integrity of the game to be jeopardized, unless there's a scenario with the owner who was telling the coach to lose games. But in defense to that scenario, only a little bit. There was the idea of let's lose these games to get a quarterback. Look, Joe Burrow was just in that same class. So
right? And
you've seen teams on purpose lose, but it was always something that was perceived by people. Right?
It was
like,
always
they're tanking
something
on
that
purpose.
was
They want a better
perceived by
draft pick.
people.
But to hear the
right,
owner
like they're tanking on purpose. They want a better draft pick. But to hear the owner put a monetary value,
and then you add in the component of the racial stuff that's going on in the NFL with the black coaches.
And then you add in the component of the racial stuff that's going on in the NFL with the black coaches.
But going back to the Chris Paul thing, I think Daniel, if you go up to a kid who's playing at a Division I school,
I think Daniel, if you go up to a kid who's playing
at a lower level
Division
Big
I
Ten
school. And he plays
he's the fourth guy
at
off
a
the
lower
bench,
level
gets
Big
12
Ten
minutes
school,
a game, and
and
you go up
he's
to him
the
and
fourth
like, hey,
guy
buddy,
off
you're
the
shooting
bench
50%
who
from
gets
three.
12 minutes
Not
a game.
this game, right?
And you go
this
up to
game
him
when
and
you go
like,
out
hey,
there and
buddy, you're shooting 50%
here's
from
$25,000.
Not this game, right? This
We're
game
not
when you
talking
go
about
out there
the Johnny Manziels and the Tim Tebow's, the Zions of the world, who now with the NIL
We're not
deal
talking
can
about
make
the
some
Johnny
money.
Manziels and the
I'm talking
Tim
about like
Tebow's
the
and
average
Zions of
Joe on the
world
team
now
who
with
has
the
no
NIL
professional
deal can make
aspirations.
some money.
That's where the integrity
I'm
of the
talking
game
about like the average Joe on the team
can
who
be
has
tainted.
no professional.
Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. I think even for, and I don't know the stories too well. I don't know the names, but I remember some examples that were thrown out before it was, past what must have been over for like 6 months. Like Jersey had just, legalized pretty much on day one as soon as it got done. But there were very few states that had legalized sports betting. And I was sat at a conference and it was a bunch of old it was ex-NFL players that, they're from older generation, right? And also the sports integrity guys that were talking, right? And they were bringing out examples of running backs fumbling the ball 3 times in bowl games with no fumbles on the year, or very, very, very few fumbles on the year going into the game. So like the idea of fumbling 3 times in a single game, just absolutely ridiculous. And then when they did investigation and they squeezed the guy a bit, they found out, yeah, he had thrown the game. He'd been paid to fumble. And it was insane what the amount was that he was paid to fumble. And it just makes you think about what kind of situation college kids are in, that they would literally be willing to throw a bowl game for less than $5,000.
Okay, so you answered my question. When you said insane, was it like 6 figures, or insane like really that much, which was what you answered?
Insane like, the second you get a job and you're out in the real world, it's not really that big of an issue. You know what I mean? Like, it's like now you're talking about amounts that it's like it's a car payment or rent, right? Or mortgage. But, you got these examples. But there's just so many things that are changing, evolving with the way that sports betting is being introduced and the way that leagues are starting to change, especially around with the college players and the college players being able to do deals and things like that, that it's, I think it's just such an interesting time in sport, right? Some of the things that drove me crazy, right, when I first moved over here, because, remember this, when I came over here in 2014, PASPA was still in place, sports betting wasn't legal. You weren't seeing much by way of casino advertisements on the television in like Oklahoma, and you're like, okay, well, here's the tribal casino that's 2 hours away. Come visit us and come to the resort. You just weren't really seeing it, right? But then, like when I landed over here, it even took me a minute to just sort of acclimate and wrap my head around it. But I live pretty close to the city center, and when you walk down the high street, which is basically like a main street, right? So Main Street, at one point in time, now a lot of them are closed, right? But at one point in time, within a 1.5 mile stretch, there was 17 betting shops from top to bottom. And, Coral, Ladbrokes, Paddy Power, like you name it, right? Like just boom, 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 right? Up and down the vein. Offshoots, like if it's not right on Main Street, okay, here's a side street, there's a betting shop, right? Everywhere, right? And it took me a minute to get used to that, right? And what took me even more time to get used to was the fact that you would actually see, you'd see a dad walking with his kid, and they'd come by the betting shop, and then the dad would be like, hang out outside, I'm going to run in and place a bet, and leave their kid outside of the shop, go place the bet, come back, continue on, right? And that is just sort of odd to me. And then I started paying closer attention to what we were seeing on the TV, right? And, World Cup time comes around, and Sky, which is the television provider over here, but also a major casino brand, was flashing things across the screen, was like, okay, if this guy scores in the next 90 seconds, here's what you get type thing, right? Press your little blue button on your remote to place your bet, right? It's like, okay, so you got in-game betting going on with constant promotion coming through. You had advertisement after advertisement after advertisement after advertisement. I think at one point they added it up, and they were like, every third advertisement is a sports betting or a casino app advertisement, right? Like everything. And this was going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
This happened very similarly. My chair keeps just dropping. It's been the weirdest thing. I don't know if you've noticed it, but this happened similar to the daily fantasy boom around 2015, 2016, DraftKings and FanDuel, where it's fantasy football, but you rotate every week. You have a salary cap. I mean, dude, very similar to what you're saying about the advertisement. In one commercial break, which is what, let's say 3 minutes, right? Your average commercial break in between, a turnover on downs and the game coming back. it would be a DraftKings commercial, Pizza Hut, FanDuel commercial, the new Toyota that's dropping, then DraftKings, all within a commercial break. And then that's when they got in trouble, because over here in the States, and New York in particular, they spent about $25 million on advertising in week 1 of that season. And then in the off season, New York came in and said, no more daily fantasy. You're not allowed to. And then they overturned it where they sold them on the idea that it's skill-based, it's not gambling. That's a whole nother conversation. But then they brought it back. But it's very similar to what you're saying. You're watching a Premier League game, and they're showing that kind of thing. So it just resonated with me thinking about that.
Yeah. And so you go through these, waves. Do you have kids at all?
No kids, no girlfriend, nothing.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So, it's the things that you don't think about, when it's just you, right? Like when it's just you, it's totally different, because it's like, I'm experiencing this. I'm not thinking about how this is impacting others. Right. And I think, introduce my first child and start, she starts becoming of age where she's paying attention to what's going on the television, and she's asking questions about what's going on the television. And then you just find yourself in strange situations where you're just like, why is there every other damn commercial a commercial where my daughter's getting exposed to this, right? Like, why is this going on in match constantly? Every single Pro League game, every single UEFA game, every single everything, why is this just being jammed down our throats? And why are the kids able to see this on primetime television? And so that is just, as a father, that was just something that started to dawn on me, which was like, it's just too early. It's just, interesting. And that's just a personal thing. Right. So, but what I did like about some of the steps that the UK has taken on this is, there's no advertising in the match. There's no advertising before 9 p.m. Right. Like, so the kids are well asleep, and now it's all post 9 p.m. You still get the jerseys with the logos on it and stuff like that. But it's a different experience when you've got, kids who are massively in sports watching, and they're asking questions versus now, they're not asking questions, so it's just one of those things that is like a parent, you're like, do I really need to explain this right now? So yeah, it's interesting. But like, I got a couple of calls over the weekend right after the Super Bowl, and actually really kind of just peppered throughout the playoff run, where, like, for example, some people that I grew up with in Missouri that I've been talking to about what's going on with all of this for years, who are literally like, tunnel vision, it's not here, so we don't understand it, and this is a topic that we're just kind of like, really, like, all back to what I was saying at the beginning of the conversation, just aware that this is a problem, or it can become a problem, or that it's even a classified addiction, right? So like, the concept of trying to explain to people what this is in locations where they're not inundated with ads, where sports books not legal yet, where the only access that they have to gamble legally anyway is if they get in the car and drive down to the riverboat or to the casino. It's been sort of an interesting conversation to have with folks to sort of live in that vacuum, right? Well, now they're like, well, shit, now that we're watching these games on a national level, they're being advertised everywhere. It's not just market specific, it's across the entire country. We're seeing it, just constant advertising for FanDuel or for DraftKings or for, whoever the sports book is in the state, Barstool, whatever, whoever it is, right?
And hold on real quick, not even the advertisement for the particular sports book. The networks that broadcast the games now have the point spreads on the breakdowns, and they're talking about props. Because also, Daniel, look, it was always the elephant in the room that people just ignored. I believe that every sports fan has made a bet at some point in their life. It's a take that I just think I think it's a layup. Like, I think I would put odds that it's favored that that's the case, right? So there was always a subset of fans that would watch these games, and the Jimmy the Greek stuff early on, when you were never allowed to say that, oh, this team's gonna cover the -6, but he would work around it by saying, you know what, Daniel, I think the Bears are gonna cover by double digits. I'm watching it, I'm like, oh, okay, professional better Jimmy the Greek, he thinks they're gonna cover the 6. So, but it was always something that the NFL was very hypocritical about, right? Like, the NFL has a lot of its issues, and it's the number one sport in the country. 100 million people watch the Super Bowl. The ratings were through the roof, and it's only going to get bigger and better, right? But they always treated betting and bettors like it was frowned upon, right? Like, they looked at you with the stank eye, and it's what made the Thursday Night Football Falcons-Jaguars game relevant. It was the fantasy football aspect and the gambling aspect to that, which goes back to what you were saying about all your friends or clients or anyone, patients that would speak to you. I've had the same experience with my friends. Now with all the apps, they're like, oh, dude, this shit is addicting, man. How do you do it? How do you do it? I was like, I do it because I've been doing this for about 2 decades, and I had to go through some whack shit for me to overcome and realize, like, hey, man, I don't need to bet the 3 o'clock tennis match in Australia just so I could get my fix in.